Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy that you can join and be here with us today. Today's lesson is in session 10, and it's called Why Listen? Of course, it's on page 91 if you have a quarterly with you. And we're still in the book of Ecclesiastes, and we're still talking with the teacher, who, of course, is Solomon. We're going to be in chapter 4, verses 13, all the way through chapter 5, verses 7. Now, we're not going to be covering all those verses, but we're going to be covering a few of them. So, today's lesson is going to talk about listening. Now, I know most of us, when we were kids, our parents would try to tell us something, and we'd let it go in one ear and out the other. We never would listen to anything they said. Even though they were imparting wisdom to us, we just didn't want to listen. We just didn't want to listen. And today, our kids are no different than what we were, because they're the same way. They just think, nah, I ain't going to listen to that. You know, they don't know what they're talking about. They're not listening to him. But many mistakes down through the years have been made because people haven't listened to what was being told to them. And that's today, Solomon, who is the teacher, is going to instruct us as the reader that it is wise to heed the warning of past mistakes and take the wise advice of godly counselors. You know, and that's so true in our spiritual life, is sometimes we just don't listen. When we read the Bible, sometimes we don't listen to what God's telling us in the Bible. Sunday mornings when we're sitting out in the pews and the preacher's up there preaching, sometimes we're just not listening to what he says. And that's where we make a lot of mistakes sometimes, because we just don't listen. You know, the teacher wrote this book as a record of his search for the meaning of life. And he began with a record of his own personal failed attempts at discovering what life's meaning was. He pursued several paths. Nevertheless, each one of them were dead ends. So Solomon looked at different things and went down different paths to find different things. But in the end, he realized it was a dead end. But in his search for the meaning of life, Solomon discovered life only makes sense when we acknowledge God. You know, while it's impossible for us as fallen humans living in a fallen world to understand the various seasons of life, people should recognize that God in his sovereignty has appointed all of them, and that they are appropriate to his purpose. So all the seasons of life, God has appointed, and they do have a purpose. So we asked ourselves, what is God's purpose? Well, it's to teach people that he should be at the center of their lives. You know, the ability to be active and enjoy the fruits of one's endeavors in life is a gift from God. Therefore, one should enjoy God's blessings and do good. You know, but as human beings, we need to live life with an appropriate understanding of the present fallen world in which we are living. We need to understand that this is a fallen world. You know, living in a world where sin thrives, it's difficult. I mean, there's a lot of pitfalls. And in its present state, it's chaotic at sometimes, and it will never satisfy our deepest longings. It will never do it. So living in a fallen world means living in a dying world. And we can see that this is what's happening. This world is slowly dying. But finally, we see that Solomon submits what God said in the beginning. It is not good for man to be alone. You know, a life lived in fellowship with others is better than a life lived in isolation. So we as Christians, we need that fellowship. It's what keeps us going. It keeps us all grounded in the faith. And we have somebody we can talk to and listen to them on their advice or their counsel. So that's what Solomon finally found out. And as we read, we're going to see further what's going on here. Now we're going to start with verse 13 in chapter 4. And let's go ahead and read that verse and see what the teacher says about it. Better is a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer pays attention to warnings. The teacher recognized that having a teachable spirit was necessary for living a meaningful and successful life. When we're younger, we're able to learn things a lot quicker than what we are when we're older. Because once we're old, we figure, well, we know everything. We've already lived that. We know what this is. But valuing and receiving instructions from a wise counselor is central to the Bible's concept of wise living. And I think when we get old, we think that we know too much. And of course, children aren't like that. They soak up everything you tell them. You may not think they're listening, but sometimes they do listen. So, and getting this instruction from wise people, that's central to the Bible's teaching of wise living. So when we don't do that, we become like fools who arrogantly despise instructions and wisdom. So we don't want to be like that. We want to be kind of smart, so we don't want to be foolish. In ancient Israel, the general consensus was that young people were foolish and old people wise. Kings were supposed to be guided by wisdom. Now, Solomon used irony to teach the wisdom of being teachable, stating that a poor but wise youth is better than an experienced king who has sat on the throne many years, but is no longer willing to listen to wise counsel. And I think the older we get, sometimes we get like that, where we're no longer wanting to listen to wise counsel. Instead of being like the young person who will sit and listen, even though we may be poor, we can be wise too. This young male who Solomon was talking about, possibly a teenager, was teachable and willing to pay attention to the insightful advice of others. The older king's refusal to listen to wise counsel was foolish and shameful. So that's what Solomon's talking about, the teacher's talking about in verse 13. So let's go and look at verses 14 through 16. And it says, "For he came from prison to be king, even though he was born poor in his kingdom. I saw all the living who move about and under the sun follow a second youth who succeeds him. There is no limit to all the people who were before them, yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. This too is futile, and a pursuit of the wind." So we can see that in verse 14, the young man was the most unlikely person to be a king or be recognized as being wise. For he came from prison. And as a prisoner, he would have been deprived of the ability to make any decisions for himself, and he would have been at the mercy of others and either disdained or forgotten by society. So, describing him as being poor means he came from humble beginnings. Solomon's bottom line was that wisdom does not depend on one's birth, his social status, or where he came from, or his wealth or his age. Now, this teaching is both a warning and an encouragement at the same time. Even in the best of conditionings for learning, wisdom is not guaranteed. And the worst conditions cannot in themselves keep one from attaining wisdom. So Solomon's story is reminiscent of Joseph. Now remember, Joseph was released from prison in order to rule over Egypt as Pharaoh's second in command. So it doesn't matter who we are. If we're young, been in prison, we can still learn wisdom. But at the same time, when we get older, we seem to not recognize that we can still learn. We think we know everything. So Solomon's telling us it doesn't matter who we are, we can obtain wisdom. And I think that's still true today. I get a little smarter sometimes, and then sometimes I get a little dumber. But we also see that the teacher witnessed a second youth who succeeded the first young man who had replaced the old foolish king. Now the people who once adored the first young man who became king now followed the second one. So you see, the young man who replaced the old, the foolish king, was in his reign came to an end just as the foolish king's reign did before him. So regardless of whether one is foolish or wise, one's time on earth is short-lived. We're only here for a short time. Now, the third king's popularity appears to have surpassed that of his two predecessors. Regardless of his idolization and influence, they were also fleeing. That didn't matter. So it doesn't matter how great a king he was or how much the people loved him. Those of the next generation would fail to appreciate all that he had accomplished and would soon forget him, period. Now, this too is similar to what happened to Joseph. Even though he saved the lives of multitudes of people, he was soon forgotten by the pharaohs and the people of Egypt. So it doesn't matter what we know, how much we think we know, we're soon forgotten. Now, Solomon, the teacher, knew that the whims of the masses change directions as quickly as the wind. And that's so true today. People change from one way to the other way. And that human aspirations for eternal glory is as futile as a pursuit of the wind. We're not going to find eternal glory ourselves. It's just like the wind. We'll never catch it. Jesus' question was indicative of the teacher's observation when he asked, "For what does it benefit someone to gain the whole world, yet lose his life?" And you understand where Solomon's going here. All this other stuff was just a waste. We need to be looking at the wisdom in the Bible. It's going to tell us how we're going to find what we truly need in this life and the next life. Now we're going to skip on over to chapter 5, and we're going to start with verse 1 there. And it says, "Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Better to approach in obedience than to offer the sacrifice as fools do, for they ignorantly do wrong." Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Better to approach it in obedience than to offer the sacrifices as fools do. You know, there's two things that we need to worry about here that Solomon's going to do, because there's two of them in here. And it's concerning worship. The word guard is a warning that means to be cautious or to be careful doing something. Okay? So here, guard your step means to think carefully before taking actions when you go into the house of God. So we need to be careful about what we're going to do when we go into the house of God. Instead of approaching worship nonchalantly, as a lot of people do, one must approach worship reverently and circumspectly, and recognizing there are consequences to how one worships God. Now, to worship God accepts as that which comes from a heart devoted to obeying Him. Now, in contrast, fools think that as long as they make some religious gestures to God, then their worship is acceptable to Him. Now, as Christians, we know better than that. We know that God doesn't accept that, because the teacher's telling us that also in this lesson. You know, those people, they are ignorant of what it means to worship God, because they believe expressions of worship are distinct from a life of obedience. It's two different things, they think. But the scriptures are very clear that God will not accept the worship of the disobedient. Now, the prophet Samuel said, obeying the Lord is more important than offering sacrifices to Him. And that's in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 22. Our expressions of worship are an offense to God if they do not come from a heart that's submitted to Him. Now, get what we're saying here. Our expressions of worship are an offense to God if they do not come from a heart that's submitted to Him. Now the fool does not know how dangerous it is to enter into worship with such disregard for God. And I'm going to tell you about that here in a few minutes. We're going to go a little deeper into that, okay? Now the second thing regarding worship is that people should be careful to abstain from saying something they really do not mean, or they would not say if they gave it more thought. Okay? A lot of times people will say things and they really didn't mean it, but it's done out before they could stop it. Now, this can happen at any time. People can be singing songs with lyrics that they do not mean. They can be praying prayers, or they're just empty words or cliches. You know, there's nothing we can say that will impress God. Nothing. You know, we can't do anything or inform him of something he doesn't already know. We can't do that. We're humans. You know, what we need to do is abstain from making any empty promises to God. Now, I'm sure there's been times in your life when you promised that you're going to do better for God, but only get you out of this trouble that you're in. And the minute God got you out of that trouble, you went right back to where you was at. So there's times when people do that. And I'm not saying that you've done it or that I've done it, but there's times when people really has. And you know, as the saying goes, think before you speak. And why do you want to do that? Because just as those with a lot on their minds have trouble resting, so do those who talk a lot. They just cannot control their tongues. So they talk, and before you know it, they talk themselves into sinning and getting themselves into trouble. So your tongue can get you in a lot of trouble. The book of James talks a lot about the tongue. It can get you in a whirl of heat. So think about what you're going to say before you say it. Now, we also see the teacher talks about praying. You know, Solomon's instructions, they were similar to Jesus' words to his disciples before he taught them to model prayer. When you pray, don't babble like the Gentiles, since they imagine that they'll be heard for their many words. And I think sometimes I may say too many words when I could shorten it up, but I'm not trying to do it to impress God. It's just that sometimes I have trouble making a point without using a lot of words, and I'm sure you do too. But we don't want to get up there and just babble on and on and on and on. It's what the teacher's telling us. So don't be like them, because your Father knows the things you need before you even ask him. So he knows all this. Now that doesn't mean that we should not pray. It just means that we should be more focused on God and more mindful of who he is when we do pray. Now that pretty much says a lot. That was verse 2 and 3 that we were talking about there. And so we're going to go on down to verses 4 through 7. Now let me go ahead and read those for you. It says, when you make a vow to God, don't delay filling it, because he does not delight in fools. Fulfill what you vow. Better that you do not vow than that you vow and not fulfill it. Do not let your mother bring guilt on you. I'm sorry, not your mother, but your mouth. Bring guilt on you. And do not say in the presence of the messenger that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry with your words and destroy the work of your hands? For many dreams bring fertility, so do many words. Therefore, fear God. Now, we can see in verses 4 through 6, they have their background in Moses' teaching in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 21 through 23. And it concerns making a vow to God. A vow involves an oath to God, promising to offer something to him if he would act on behalf of the person who's making the vow. Now, sometimes people make vows in the midst of great danger or need, but sometimes it's just out of desire. You know, let's take, for instance, Hannah. Now, she was unable to have children, so she went to the tabernacle and vowed to God that if he gave her a son, she would give him to the Lord all the days of his life. Now, in grateful response to the Lord's granting her request, her husband offered a vow offering on their behalf in gratitude for what God had done. So he offered a vow too in gratitude. So, and of course you know that was Samuel who was her son. She offered him to the priest, and he stayed in the temple all his life. So she made a vow, she kept her vow. God never required anyone to make a vow to him, never. But failing to keep a voluntary vow to the Lord and his house was a serious offense and equated to breaking the third commandment, which forbids misuse of the Lord's name. So be careful what you do. God's final word in Leviticus warns of the costliness of breaking a vow. And that's Leviticus chapter 27. The voluntary act of making a vow to God was the highest worship one could offer God. Voluntary expressions of worship are more a blessing to God than doing only what is required. It is foolish to take what is a delight to the Lord and turn it into self-centered grandstanding before him. Acting as if one's delighting God, when in truth that person just seeks to advance himself or herself with grand promises. So that serves no purpose. God does not like grandstanding or self-centeredness. So that's what Solomon's saying, and that's what the teacher says, and it is so very true today. You know, God expects his people to keep their commitments. But people often look for ways to back out of the commitments to God and others. But an expression of devotion and worship to the Lord faithfully does what we do what we said we would do. Now, it dishonors God when we refuse or fail to keep our word. Therefore, it would be better never to make a vow than to make one and not fulfill it. Now, the teachers says, do not sin with your mouth or complain with your comments to God or his ministers. So that's one thing that Solomon is saying here. Failure to keep one's promises to God robs God of the honor and worship that is due him. He deserves and robs the individual of the blessings and honors that come from him to those who keep their vows. So lying to God has serious consequences. And just in case one thinks this is only an Old Testament teaching, if you remember Ananias and Sapphira, who lost their lives because they lied to the Holy Spirit, it's not just the Old Testament, folks. It's the New Testament too. It's the same today. You know, we need to be like the psalmist in Psalm 66, verse 13 through 15, who determined to keep his vows to the Lord. Having dreams of what one might do for God and expressing elaborate plans to serve him means nothing to him apart from faithful obedience. What matters to God, and should therefore matter to every individual, that we live our lives in complete devotion to him. That is what it means to fear God. Living our life in devotion to him. Being obedient to him. Now, Christian leaders must willingly listen to wise counsel when leading. Brother Tony listens to other preachers and other godly men who have been in the ministry for a long time. I listen to Brother Tony. I listen to all the older Christians here because they have wise counsel that I can learn from. And as believers, we are to worship God in reverence obedience. Wise believers carefully weigh the promises they make to God and others, knowing God will expect them to keep any promises made. So, as the teacher says, it's better not to make a vow at all than to make one that we can't keep. So keep that in mind as you go through the week. And read through this again if you'd like to. Brother Tony and I hope you have a great week, and we hope all the blessings God has will fall on you. Until we meet again, have a great one. Bye-bye.